right, welcome everyone. I was trying to get some music to play, and of course it wouldn't.
Of course.
I'm Kelly Harkins. I'm the director of the American Science Fiction Fantasy Media Track. Boy, that's always a mouthful. I had tried. I had suggested we shorten it, and everybody was like, "No, it says what it is." I'm like, "Yeah." So, but tonight for our live panel, we are going to be talking about Carnival Row. Of course, it's been a while since the show's been on. It came out literally during Con last year. So we've had a lot of time to think over this. And I wanted to give my panelists here a chance to introduce themselves. John Paul, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, John Paul. Love being a part of Kelly's panel. She always runs a great one, and proud to once again, I noticed, be the only guy on one of her panels. She seems to surround me with women all the time. So,
Corinne?
I'm Corinne O'Flynn, and this will be my second Dragon Con. I came last year on the heels of one of my friends, and I fell in love. I couldn't believe it. My mind was blown. I've done Comic Cons before, but never Dragon Con, and I'm new to Kelly's panels. This is my first time with several of you. I usually do the Urban Fantasy track with Carol.
Cool. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy. This actually is my 16th Dragon Con, crazy enough. So I've been coming here a while. It was a little different back then, but yeah, I'm a big sci-fi fan, and I also have been on a few panels and for the track before, and I'm really excited to talk about this show because this was one that really sparked a lot of people's imaginations. So.
Carol?
I'm Carol Malcolm. I'm the director of the Dragon Con Urban Fantasy track. So I'm excited to be doing this with Kelly. She's been on one of my panels before, actually the Lost Girl panel, the very first year that the track existed in 2013. But this is the first time I've been able to be on one of yours. So I'm very excited. Thank you for having me.
And Steph.
I'm Stephanie Warshaw. This would have been my 20th con, my 10th year volunteering, and I am the assistant director for the American Sci-Fi Fantasy Media Track.
All right. Well, I just wanted to get in. I will apologize. I might have a cat face stick here. And wait a minute.
Never apologize for cats.
No.
Yeah, they won't take it. So, but I wanted to bring this up because, like I said, I was a huge fan of the show. And I know Carol and I actually debated for a little bit on kind of where this falls on the genre scheme of things. Whether, because it has that gritty urban feel, but it's got a mythic feel, but yet it has kind of an alt history feel and all these kind of things. So that was a conversation that came up because it hits a lot of different notes. And we kind of went back and forth on whether it was supposed to be an alt earth. And actually, just doing some digging for this panel, I actually found, and I'll share it in our notes, that they actually did an RPG, a tabletop RPG game with it. It has the maps and everything, and it really clearly shows it's a totally different world.
Right.
So I was like, oh, well, that
That's
kind
you.
of straightens that out. But I wanted to kind of see what your thoughts were on the tone they took and kind of the vibe and what things resonated with you from that.
Yeah, well, so I do some content directing and some IT for the alt history track. And when I initially saw the trailer for, the trailer on all the media for this show, when they had airships and they have actual steampunk elements and, crazy inventors and mad scientists and all these other, these subplots and just the mix of the Victorian feel of a lot of the costumes, which for me, I was a huge fan of the costumes. So when I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's an alt history one. But then it's not an alt history. It's just a completely new built world that they've built. And I don't know if any of you guys have actually checked out the RPG. That when you told me about that, Kelly, that was the first time I've heard of it, but I don't know if you've ever played it before. But the fact that they've taken the time to, create maps, and it's almost this Tolkien quality to the massive world building. You can see this first season was just the tip of the iceberg. And for me, even though it did borrow from a lot of genres, it did end up falling very squarely into the high fantasy genre, even though it did, straddle the fence in some aspects of it. But overall, just the entire world that they built for me was just squarely high fantasy.
I agree with you on the world building. I thought it was mind blowing. I thought it was more like steampunky Gaslamp because of the whole Victorian piece and the airships and the way that there is some technology, but it's Gaslampy and but I didn't realize, like, I knew that like the Tirnanock and Anoon and like all the cities had different names and like where they were from when they talked about the coasts, but it wasn't until Imogen said that it was the 7th century, as if it was modern times. Like, this is the 7th century. Of course, I can do whatever I want. I was like, wow, like, we're not, you know, like, because they did it so well. Like, I think they layered all of these things, the familiar and the fantasy, so well that it really, you have to remind yourself that this is like, it's not even alternate history. Yeah, it's fantasy.
In terms of genre, a friend of mine pointed out earlier this week that if you compare it to His Dark Materials, which has very similar tone in some ways and very similar look in some aspects, and that is clearly an alt history, you know, clearly straddling the different parallel universes, and that if you compare it to something that is very very similar but very starkly, you know, parallel universes, you can see where it hits the marks on high fantasies, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, and to me, I'm a huge Brandon Sanderson fan, and this felt so much like, because he's so well known for his world building, and you could take the Mistborn books, especially Mistborn era 2, and just say, okay, everybody's done filming. Okay, we're going to use your sets, and we're just going to film our story. You can just drop it in there and do so much of it. But yeah, you're right. Some of the little details, the layering, some of the stuff that wasn't important to the main story, but it made it feel like you were living in a real world. You just, I mean, such little things. You had the martyr, you know, the Church of the Martyr. There was one, this was in the rewatch when watching it. At one point, someone in the background, instead of doing the Catholic cross, they were doing the circle of the noose.
Yes,
and such.
circle of the noose, yeah.
But the first time I saw it was in the background, not even being focused on. They fleshed out so much that was in the world. It was great.
Well, and I loved how they referred to that, and it kind of reminded me of Game of Thrones, where they like when they talked about the gods and the old gods and the new gods, the swear of God's noose, and it's almost like Christ on the cross. You know, it's one of those, and there was a book that I read about, I can't remember, I think it was Stephen Hawking. No, I can't, it doesn't matter who wrote it. And they said, you know, thank God that Jesus was crucified. Crucifixion was the mode of death back in the day, because otherwise we'd have a whole bunch of little kids with little gold electric chairs on their necklaces. And it's like, it looks so odd seeing the hanging martyr, like with a noose in the world. But it's like, well, if that's the way that it was, that's the way that it was at the time. So it's again, one of those layers that no one even addresses. It's just the thing. It's just the way that it is.
Mm-hmm. And so we can talk about it in places like this. Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was the crux of our discussion too, was in terms of whether it was a real world scenario or whether it was, you know, a completely different place. And that's why I made the argument for you, Kelly, that it was definitely a different world. If it had been, you know, a real world situation, I would have said, hey, that's urban fantasy right there. But it obviously was not. So,
Steph?
What's that? It kept reminding me very much of late 19th century England with the fairies and the mythology, but yet it didn't quite sync up. So it was very hard for me to figure out if it took place in a completely different world or if it was something based on our history, because so much of it drew from.
It looked familiar. That was the thing.
Yes.
It had a familiar feel.
It was familiar.
You could almost expect like the East India Company pop out somewhere.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Well, I think it's one of the keys is making it feel just comfortable enough for the viewer not to be pulled out of it, and just original enough that you're experiencing something so fantastical, but it feels comfortable.
Yes.
Yeah, it's masterfully done. It's just felt so well done.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think when it went, there were times when I felt that they were drawing very deliberate parallels between our society and their society.
Oh yeah.
For me, this might not be an opinion that everybody shared. That was actually where the show was weakest. I think that the show was most interesting for me, where it was completely doing something, building completely different, interspecies relationships and all these, the power structure and who are the people doing these attacks on Tiernanak and, all this is fictitious intrigue. For me, that was a lot more compelling than when it was very clearly trying to draw parallels to, real world historic. I just thought it was a little more, for me, it was just more engaging. I didn't think it was the strongest use of the show's time to try to draw parallels between our world and theirs. Although I know why they did it in terms of narratives, but I just felt that it was a lot more interesting when they were just doing their own thing and just completely diving in and going all in on this, fantastical world that they had built.
Well, it does make you wonder if the second season they won't spend as much time on that kind of thing because they've already established with us making those parallels, that we've already made the assumptions or we've made the connection, and so therefore they can go all in on the element you're talking about, Andy. I'm just curious, but we'll find out someday.
Yep.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah. A lot of the. It's interesting that we're seeing a strength in something that a lot of the reviewers, when they are kind of reading back over it, they talk about how they felt it was very bloated because there was just too much of that stuff. Where we're, of course, like, oh, world building, yay, it's awesome, because there were so many elements within that. Now, actually, Donna brings up a good comment in our comments here that I want y'all to kind of think of. If you were trying to convince somebody to, like, hey, you got to check this show out, what would you say to kind of get them to be interested?
I'd probably go back to what I was saying before. I would pull up stories. I have so many of my friends who are Brandon Sanderson or other, pick some of your favorite fantasy authors. And I would say, if you enjoy those books, this is one of the best adaptations of a book, which is just original, but it's what you've always wanted to see. Your favorite novel done justice on the screen, but an original story, so you don't already know what's going to happen. That's where I would go. I
actually just did that this past week after rewatching it to prepare for this panel. I was telling a girlfriend of mine who doesn't even read fantasy, I'm like, you need to check this out and what I talked about was it is such an other world, but the otherworldness is so effortlessly layered in. Like you really do get it drip fed to you, so that you forget, like, and by the time you're done, you're like, oh my God, like I feel like I just visited this other place. Like the war, like the segregation, the caste system, like everything that, and Andy mentioned that, the social issues that we have are not her favorite part of that show. I think that makes that for me, makes the show that much more relatable. I don't have to think about why those things are happening. I can just focus on the other things because we understand those things. But I just talked about the richness of the world and how unbelievably done it was.
And so I have a lot of friends that are cosplayers. I'm a cosplayer myself, so I can tell you how I sold it to a lot of my friends. It has fairies. It looks amazing. Amazon is known. They just pour so much money into all their shows. Every single one of the shows they've ever seen, regardless of what you think of the narrative or the acting or whatever, they always look incredible. And I mean, this show, the fairies, were one of the things that drew me in. And I totally sold that show to a bunch of cosplayer friends of mine. You have got to see these fairies. They look real. The wings, the costumes, the wigs, it looks amazing. So that's how I sold it to a lot of my friends.
And don't forget, this is something cosplayers finally have gotten. They can wear wings to a convention and not get in everybody's way.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
I'm sure we're going to see a lot of it. I think for myself, I would tell someone, well, if you like things that have kind of a steampunk or alternate history look, and yet you have the same kinds of creatures and the real world setting that you would find in urban fantasy, but you're in a completely different world with its own history and with its own characteristics, then you should give it a shot. And I think if you can make comparisons to a couple of different things, that sometimes that appeals to people. I mean, I think that's one reason it had the success that it did, is because it did have broad appeal You know,
Mhm.
obviously, all of us who may have a preference for one thing over another, you know, for the majority of things, that at least for something like that, it kind of, you know, it kind of ticked off all the boxes for us.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So a little something a little lighter. Who would you say was your favorite character in the whole thing, and why?
Hmm.
I'll go ahead and say it just because mine surprised me so much. I wasn't through rewatching it when I got your questions, and I finished and I started thinking about it. And going into the first watch, I would have sworn, no question, it would have been either Philo or Vignette, one of the two. I mean, I can say Orlando Bloom. I can't say Kara's last name, so I'm just going to say Vignette. But I would have swore it had been one of those two. But after watching it the second time, Imogen, I love
Yes.
the character Imogen. She was somebody who grew so much. You saw her change and show such strength, and she didn't change unrealistically. She didn't become unrecognizable, but there was just something about her that it just caught me by surprise. So it was probably her, if not, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but the theater guy, the one who became the chancellor's new assistant, and he was his teacher for a while.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The older guy who,
Right.
Runyon Millworthy. Runyon,
Yes,
Runyon
Millworthy.
Millworthy.
He's a close runner-up.
So my favorite character, if it's not, you know, the Cara Delevingne, I believe that's how we
There
say
you
that. Wasn't Philo or Vignette, it has to be Tourmaline. I think that she, for me, she plays like Vignette's past. She's in the past. She's that Tina Knock, and then when she comes to the thing, she knows all about Philo's, like how she's going to react when she finds out that Philo is alive. And I'm assuming we're not going to have any problem sharing spoilers during this panel since the show.
It has been here,
But I loved the way Tourmaline kept being Vignette's touchstone during the story, and she's so personally tortured by the fact that their relationship is not what it once was, and yet their friendship kind of holds that, like their friendship will like rise above and survive whatever is coming. I really did enjoy her character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did like Philo and Vignette. I loved Tourmaline. I thought she had the nicest costumes. I thought she had the prettiest wig. She had like, so I'm just, you know, from a cosplayer perspective. I think that I'm a person that really likes villains and bad guys. So I actually really liked Sophie and Piety. Those were pretty much they did a lot with very little, especially Indira Varma, who it's funny because a lot of the early press for this show, probably fueled by Amazon, is that this is going to be Amazon's Game of Thrones. And, you know, they did that. They actually went ahead and hired some actors from Game of Thrones to sort of just icing on the cake for that.
Right.
But Indira Varma is amazing and electrifying. And pretty much everything she does, she can just stand there and glare at someone, and it's a whole arc, you know? And so I just thought she did a lot. And I just really wanted to know more about her backstory, and I just thought she was very not sympathetic but understandable. Like I understood her motivations, which I think, again, she wasn't given a lot of dialogue, she wasn't given a lot of exposition, but you just understood where she was coming from, even though, you know, she did awful things. I think she was kind of, you know, my villain fan favorite.
And I think it made sense the way they ended up with her story. So it wasn't out of the blue, like, oh, this person's the bad guy. What?
Well, those are the scariest villains always. Those villains that have that strength. You know, they're the scariest.
And her arc is the reason is the whole season. It's the reason things are happening the way that they're happening. So it's like to see her. Right, like to know, I guess in the rewatch, that was one of the things, like when I watched it the second time, I was like, ooh, when I saw her face, I'm like, I know who you are. Like, they just did such a great job with pulling everything through. And yeah, she's a minor character with not a lot of dialogue, but she does so much to bring.
She's
like
the undercurrent, absolutely.
And she steals every scene she's in, you know?
Yeah, you do. Your eye does go to her. But I would say that probably for me, I guess it was Philo. I think, I think mainly because of just the fact that he started out in one place, and by the last episode, he has found out so much about himself that he didn't know. You know, that and I think that his decision to leave when he did and pretend he's dead and all of that, you know, I'm sure people could take issue with that, but yeah, I think that he was doing it for the right reasons, and I thought his journey was interesting from beginning to end, and I thought they handled it well. It wasn't all at once. You know, it didn't just happen all of a sudden, and it was a little bit. I mean, they managed to, even within just the 6 episodes, right? It was 6, right? They you know, you got just a little bit each time, so that you didn't get too much all at once, and they didn't dump it all at the end either. I just thought that he was a very interesting character for that reason.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'd have to say Philo, but more for the way he's so principled and very much like a Captain America in that he's going to do what's right even when everybody else is telling him not to, or when it may be to his detriment. He's still going to do the right thing, and he chooses to do the right thing, even with pretending to be, you know, dead and leaving. Yeah, that wasn't so.
Yeah, that's not cool, but yeah, whatever.
We all make mistakes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like Steph is having some technical issues, so I'm gonna jump in. I kind of agree with John Paul. I kind of waffled because, you know, of course, Philo's story arc is so central, and honestly, Vignette is the one who probably changes the least out of everybody.
Good point. Yeah.
But I know when I started watching and I was like watching Imogene, I was definitely Mean Girls, hate her. Oh, just get rid of her. When did she get her comeuppance? And then you see that slow evolution with Agrias, and, you know, how his patience with her, and it just was like, oh, you know, to the end where it's like, wow, totally didn't see that coming as far as that goes. So
no,
absolutely.
And I don't want them to be done. I don't want them to be off screen. You know, I want their storyline is really, you know, fun to watch.
Well, I think that tells us probably for the next season, you wonder sometimes are they going to pick up 5 minutes later, 5 days later, 5 months.
Right.
I don't think they want to spend a lot of the next season on a boat going somewhere. So it's probably however long it takes to get somewhere. They're probably going to jump a few weeks ahead, is my guess, if not longer.
Unless there's another shipwreck.
Or 9 months ahead.
A lot of people that I was talking to about the show and myself had is, where are they going? Like, where do they think is going to be better than where they are right now? I have to be honest. Imogen, her story arc didn't really work for me, and sorry, I know I said it didn't really work for me. The actress is wonderful. She had wonderful chemistry with Agrias, and I just didn't see what he saw in her, and I didn't really see what I saw why she changed, but the reasons that she changed were very, very self-centered, and the things about how she realized that, oh, this society affects me negatively too. Like, it wasn't really out of altruism. I didn't really feel like she changed because she fell in love with someone, but I don't feel that that's necessarily a prerequisite to changing. You know, you can fall in love with a person from a group that you otherwise have contempt for and not fundamentally change your attitudes toward. I guess I just felt like that was very like they expected a lot of filling in the blanks from the audience for that story.
See, for me, that felt very tropey. What happened with them? Yes. I feel like it's one of those things where, like, on the grand scale, on the macro, you know, racism is bad. We know that, but, you know, whatever, the system is this way. And then once you make it personal, things become very, very different for the individual who's experiencing, like, the first time connecting with somebody of the opposite, the different race, the other. So I felt like her change was very, very tropey and predictable, but enjoyable because she was so awful, you know. Yeah. Like I'm glad she's the one who's doing it, but I'm curious because she's coming back and she's like putting on a good face, like no one's looking at us, you know. And she's horrified, but she won't back down. So I agree with you that it wasn't necessarily, you know, unique, but I was glad that that happened the way that it did with her.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's very tropey. I did definitely expect it. The instant she met Agreus, I was like, this is going to happen. But what the show didn't sell me on is what he saw in her, because and that's actually a thing that I had a kind of a critique for about that storyline in general, is that it relied very heavily on the idea of respectability, and that if he behaved and dressed and acted and tried to fit into the society, that people would respect him more. And that's just not a good look, y'all. that's not something we should be like. That necessarily they needed to. They could have approached it, I think, in a more distinctive way, without relying on this idea that the other needs to have, play into respectability of the mainstream society in order for people to see that he's actually a real person and deserving of dignity. And I think that's what it was. Like, eventually she started, he actually has manners. He has more manners than the people that I.
Yeah. Well, but also in the story, sorry, Jean-Paul, the opposite happened with Philo. Yeah. They thought he was something that he wasn't, and the moment they found out, it didn't matter that he had manners or that he was the best investigator or anything. Like, so the opposite happened there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a parallel there. I mean, I think it wasn't just Agreus, though. I mean, because you see when the money troubles start to happen and her brother starts treating her differently. Yes, part of it is, realizing, what her situation is and seeing parallels in other people and realizing that, being the top of the predator chain is great. But when you're not, then you start realizing some of those other problems. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a little more subtlety, but that's fine.
Yeah. But y'all talked about how you could see where it's going in the trope. I mean, I admit I'm a sucker for romantic comedies and all the rest. I love watching When Harry Met Sally. You've Got Mail. You know what's going to happen at the end. You know where those are going. It's the journey. It's right. Not the end. It's the journey. Babylon 5, bringing up a different sci-fi. Babylon 5 told you in season 1 exactly how certain storylines were going to end. It didn't matter. What mattered was how you got there. And it was such a tight, compact story. They had to move things along so quickly. Yeah, it would have been more believable if her storyline, her change, and their connection had taken 2 seasons or 3 seasons to happen gradually. But I was impressed by how tight the story was, because so many of these streaming services and the original series for them are so drug out. Stranger Things. People seem to love Stranger Things, but the 8 or 10 episodes for one season is something Mulder and Scully could have finished in 2 episodes. So it's, I get fed up with these stretching the story out, and this one did not stretch anything. This one moved quickly.
And at the same time, it moved so quickly. I was left feeling like, especially when they had the episode where we went back in time to Tiernoff and see how their romance began, and the history with Darius and what happened there. I have the sense that I experienced so much of a timeline in such a short span of time. I think they really did that well as well. Yeah. So I agree.
Yeah. I do, although that brings up one of because I was going to say, I hate to bring up negative, but the Tiernoff, all the stuff that happened, but then they brought up the whole library thing. And that I thought was one of the weakest spots, because, she gets so upset and, she just, then she gets arrested after kind of losing it on everybody. But I was like, to me, yes, okay, this is your this is your spiritual history, but it's kind of just like this, here's your, golden ticket. And that's where they kind of just left it at that. They didn't give us any weight to it. But I think there's a lot more that they probably know, and it's just not in there.
Yeah, the library should have been introduced a little earlier. I mean, generally the pacing for me was really good for this show, because I'm, tend to wonder if there, if things dwell on certain plot points. So I thought the pacing, the really rapid fire, and the different stakes that they showed, there's I think some counted 8 or 9 different subplots in the show. So, I mean, the fact that they were able to juggle that successfully, and we all know how they all tied together at the end, and they're all starting to anyway, I thought that was really well written. But I think that the library and if you're going to introduce that as a stake, as a really, really high stake for this entire culture, it definitely should have had a little bit more gravitas from the beginning, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
Well, beyond what we said about the story arcs and thing, were there any performances or anything that you felt were just we brought up piety and things like that, but anything, secondary characters or something that you just were like, wow, you just were riveted by?
I liked Darius's character a lot, and I didn't notice it in the original. The first couple of times I watched it, when I just rewatched it, knowing now, like it's been steeped in my brain. When we see Philo as a child in the boys' home, Darius is there when he's jumping on the bed, and I didn't realize that they were like childhood friends from the beginning of time. So when we find out what happens to him, we understand better why he doesn't turn on him, and I would like to see what happens, because now Philo has chosen a side, and he's no longer got access to Darius in the cell. So now, and Darius said, "You're the only reason why I'm still here." Like, you know, so I want to know what's going to happen with that. So I really enjoyed Darius's character, their relationship, as like super secondary. Like, he's not even part of the pushing forward of the plot yet.
Yeah.
Yet.
Yet.
Yes.
Wishful thinking.
Well, Philo, I mean, I know he's one of the main characters, obviously, the main, but something I didn't catch it the first time through, because you don't necessarily know all the details, but once you know the story and what to watch for, there's so many scenes. The one that jumped out at me, but there's several exactly like this. There's one moment in one of the either first episode or second, where he's walking into the police station, and there's 2 or 3 officers sitting there talking. Whatever the topic is, he says hi to them, mentions something, and walks on past. And their topic changes, and you hear one of them say something about, "And can you believe he was passing? Yeah, what about that?" And the conversation trails off. It's not even important. You're focused on him. But the look he suddenly flashes to the side, you realize he heard them talk about someone passing. And now that you know about his character and the fact that he's passing,
Right.
he did that so many times really subtly that you wouldn't pick up on if you didn't know about it. Yeah, it was great. And so I don't know how much of that was written in and how much of it was the actor adding it himself. But I thought that was just fantastic. Again, those little bitty touches were just great.
I was a really big fan of. I'm a big fan of Alice. Is it Cridge? The woman who played the Harrisbecks, the witch.
I was going to
Oh, yeah.
say, yeah.
Oh,
The Bullet Queen.
yeah.
I worked with her for 25 years. I don't know how to say her last name, but
Alice
her,
Creed,
she
I
was
think it is.
amazing. She was creepy and gross and
Yes.
amazing.
But she's fantastic.
Yeah. That's who I was going to say. For that very reason, it was like when she was on the screen, she was the only one you were actually paying attention to. Didn't matter who else was there, because you didn't know at first, was she a good guy or was she a bad guy or whatever, and just she would pull you in such a way that I was very intrigued by her. I thought, yeah. And up until the very, up until the very end, we didn't know exactly what her, involvement was or whatever. So it was good.
There's a lot of great.
As an actress, played
lot of
her
great.
very close to her best. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there was any poorly cast characters at all. Like, every time somebody opened their mouth, it was wonderfully done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. See, to me, I was like, I kind of was torn. I kept going to the character of Aislinn, but it was more the character than the actress. I mean, she did great, but I think Jared Harris, as the Chancellor, I mean, he's so good no matter what he's in, honestly. And he went from, kind of that bombastic politician, which is kind of a cliche, to, you see when it's revealed, what his backstory and what the choices he made, he just handled it so incredibly. And you buy that this person who has done all of these things, for the sake of ambition, for the sake of politics, is still the guy who fell in love with a fairy 20 some years ago,
Right. Absalom. Yeah. Yeah. He's a good character. And it's heartbreaking. Like, again, like, I feel like I spent so much more than just one 6-episode or 8-episode season with this people. Like, it just seems so rich.
It was so full.
Yeah.
And one that surprised me a little bit, again, on the second watch, was Jonah. The spoiled son. He's not one you're really supposed to pay, even though his arc is important, more for the second season maybe than for the first. But he kind of surprises you because he's never a bad guy at all. In fact, even down to the end, when he appoints his teacher, who really does care about people and cares about the Fae, as his advisor, realizing that I need someone who I can trust, someone who will be honest with me, being there. Jonah surprised me. And again, how much of it's the writing and how much of it's the actor? You'd hope it's a good marriage of the two, adding to it. But the character of Jonah was one that I'm looking forward to the season 2 part of even more, because of where it could go.
Yeah, the acting for Jonah was so fun for me to watch, just because, you have this person that that entire, these political families have built their hopes and their dreams on, with Piety and her schemes and all this stuff. And he's so like, he's almost like not much of a leader. There's not much there, as they say, he's so easily led by his mother, and then Sophie and his father and his tutor. I mean, he's really, you kind of have to wonder how desperately Piety clung to this, idea that she did all her, her motivation for. And I just think that was very well woven, is the fact that he was the person that was never going to fulfill all the expectations that were put on him. He's just not cut out for it.
Like, why was he fighting so hard? Why didn't she understand that this wasn't the guy? Like,
exactly.
He didn't want to see it.
Yeah. But maybe he's going to be one of those, the greatness is thrust upon someone, and he actually comes to task because, we think that he's going to be led now by Sophie, and because he's dominated by strong women everywhere he turns. But, when he appointed the guy he can trust, the Runyon, at the end, it's like, okay, well, maybe he's going to surprise all of them. So I hope he does, because he'd be a cool.
He needs to watch his back.
Yeah, that's
with Sophie.
Yeah, on all sides. So.
Yeah.
I know, Andy, you mentioned you didn't like some of the parallels with the stories as far as that goes, the metaphors and allegories that they kind of chose. But I wanted to kind of see what you all took from those, what ones you thought they did well, what ones you thought they struggled with. I thought the refugee concept was actually fairly well done, because that is such a thing we're facing in our world right now. That one was one of the ones I thought was better than some of the other ones that they were like trying to kind of shoehorn in. So I wanted to kind of see what you all thought about that.
So on the refugee one, I was disappointed they didn't make Vignette more tortured by her role in bringing these people into this situation. Like, they mentioned it, she struggled with it, and then we kind of didn't go there again. And then we talked about her not really changing that much. And I thought like that was someplace they really could have dug in. Like, she is the reason a lot of people are in this terrible indenture situation, but they're also alive, because, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, but she mentions it like, I didn't really do anybody any favors. And I feel like they just kind of let that fall. Like, they could have really made her struggle with it more, because she was then put in that situation and she broke free of it. And they never addressed that she was actually free. She never gets told that Philo bought her contract. So I don't know. I feel like that was something that they could have done. I like the way they did it, but I feel like for Vignette's character, they could have really harped on that a little bit heavier. It should haunt her more.
Well, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I actually didn't mind so much the social, parallels or whatever, because I find it interesting anyway that, being, coming from an urban fantasy background as being my primary interest anyway, that, for a society to have to accept these essentially supernatural beings, the other, as part of their own world, and being reluctant to do so, I thought, that was actually fairly well done. I didn't feel as though I was getting beaten over the head with it, where they said, see, this is what we're trying to show you. I thought that I didn't think that they went overboard. Let's put it that way. And I thought that it was pretty well done, because let's face it, if we think people who don't dress the same as we do, or maybe whose skin may not be the same color as ours, or whatever, that we're going to have, there are societies that are going to have an issue with letting them do the same things that the majority gets to do? What about somebody who has horns and cloven hooves? You know, but yet is smarter than you are. You know, so to me that was an interesting parallel to make, and but again, I didn't feel as though they went overboard with it. I thought that they made made their statement, and it was ingrained into the show, and it was part of the show. For me, it just didn't feel.
Well, and I didn't mind all of that being in there because Kelly knows that I love the CW superhero shows, and I love Supergirl. I've done the panel every year for the last like 3 years, but Supergirl gets very heavy-handed with the social messages every week. It seems like, especially a couple seasons in there. This didn't get that heavy-handed with it. It focused on the main story and used these social issues to flesh out the world and show that it's part of what that world has to deal with. And yeah, the love story was a little bit more front and center than some of the stuff, but I thought it was I thought it was used more as the world building than it was the main part of the story, which I really, I like that aspect of it. Although the one piece at the very end, I'm kind of hoping they do deal with it a little bit more because it's not one we see quite as much. You almost get with the row and the quarantine and everything else going on, you almost have kind of a Japanese internment, World War II internment kind of situation going on.
Right, yeah.
Berlin Wall and like the ghettos and
Yeah, it was explicitly called the ghetto. It was almost a very World War II.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And that was cool.
I didn't really have an issue with it being heavy-handed. I mean, I think that when people say heavy-handed, what I think people usually mean is just bad writing. I mean, if you can have issues permeated throughout a show and have it be, very, very relevant and evocative, and I don't know if that makes sense, but I think like if you have a good enough writing team, you can pull off heavy-handedness, and that wasn't really the issue that I had with this. My issue that I had with the way that they presented social issues is a trope that we're actually seeing a lot more of in sci-fi, in which there's this very, very heavy parallels and very heavily borrowed from Black American experiences, but using a white woman as the face of that experience. And we see that there's a lot of different examples. I know a lot of people had an issue with Captain Marvel having a lot of symbolism with breaking chains and slavery and all these things. And I mean, there's a lot of aspects to Carnival Road's fairy line story that is directly taken from Black American history. The mutilation of dissidents in specific and very personal and intimate ways. That's something that happened to, enslaved Americans in America. The way that the indentured servitude and the ways that the whole respectability politics with Agrias and all of the stuff that happened with free Black Americans during the pre-antebellum South and what have you. All those issues are very, very explicitly taken from the Black American experience, but the face of it is a white woman. And so we see that happening more and more in sci-fi, and I think it's an issue. If you're going to borrow from the stories of Black American history, then why not pay Black American actors to play some of these roles? I mean, we have mixed race actors, and then we have Agrias, who's literally an animal, but played by a Black actor. And we have other people that are turned into animals like Darius and animal-like species. But the main face of this movement, of this oppressed race is a white woman. And I just felt like they could have done better. I think they could have done better in terms of casting and in terms of if you're gonna borrow that heavily from history, then why the bait and switch? Does that make it more relatable somehow in their minds? Or I mean, that was my gripe. I was like,
a better example, I think, of what you'd like, and me too, is Watchmen. The Watchmen series did that much better, putting the right actors. And honestly, up until Watchmen started, I thought Carnival Row was going to be my favorite series of the entire 2019. I really thought it was going to be number one for me, and then Watchmen blew it away. So it comes in number two. But some of it's exactly what you're talking about. The experiences are more real. But that does point out one thing I'd forgotten I liked. Since I mentioned Watchmen, one of the things Alan Moore did at the end of Watchmen, in order to get the world to come together, he gave them an alien to focus on, so their differences didn't matter as much. If you'll notice, when the people of society come in, and at this point, Imogen has not yet started to really care about Mr. Agrias, but still is inviting him over. The other people in society, one of the couples was a black couple who were a part of society,
Right.
but because they had an even more alien race to be, to focus on, suddenly all the humans were all alike. It's now us versus them. And the us included everybody that was human. It didn't matter what race or anything. It was subtle, and I don't know how much they intended that, but I thought that was a nice, subtle touch.
It's true. I thought of that too when I was watching it.
Yeah, Watchmen is a great comparison to make. Watchmen, I'm also a big fan of Watchmen, and there's an example where they took literal archival footage and used it as part of some of the episodes. So you cannot get more explicit and heavy-handed than actual news footage in the episodes themselves, and they pulled it off. And I think that's just what we were talking about before, about you can have these heavy issues and have it very heavily permeated stories, but you just have to be smart about it. And I think the show says, I think Carnival says some interesting things. Certainly turning the Critch that are like creatures, that are part animal and part human. I mean, it really makes that very explicit that the dehumanization of these people that don't look anything like people, and so that makes it very explicit. And I totally get why they did it. I just felt like it's a trope we're seeing a lot more of in the media, is that the face of oppression is a white woman, and then they take these narratives and these stories that are directly taken from the history of Black Americans. So I was just like, I think they could have had a little bit. I think they could have done a little better in that. Yeah.
I see what you're going for, and I can see that it's an easy one, but I also see that kind of the quintessential useless creature of, a Victorian time period was, the privileged white woman of that upper class, so whose reason for existence was so narrow, and what was she capable of, what behavior. So to me, it is, if you used even the white male, or, even if you had, I don't know, it might have been a little heavy-handed if they had, taken one of the black couple from that same class. I can see why they did it. They probably could have done it better, but like I said, I think because of the narrow role that person has, it's why it makes that contrast work, at least. I do agree that they could have there are some elements that could have been stronger as far as that goes. I think the fear culture that they built up, like John Paul mentioned, the other, we're seeing a lot of that in our world. So, and I think they played that to an extreme, but in a thoughtful way that, if you're going to do something like that, it's a tool for politics, especially.
Basically, they have to make Tourmaline a lead character in the second season. We've decided it for them. That's there you go. It can't end there, but it's a good start.
The question is, what do we think we want to see in the second season then?
Oh,
more world.
Definitely more of Daredevil.
I'd like to know more of the history of the Burg and the Pact. Like we got a lot of that when we went back to Ternanock, and we get it at the beginning with like the prologue explanations of things. But like I couldn't tell if it was like, and again, like I think that the use of things that we deal with that are tropey and in real world kind of helps, because I was thinking of, is it like America taking over the colonialists taking over North America and ruining and stealing the culture and imprisoning the people, or was it more North versus South, like with the American Revolution? Like, I wanted to know a little bit more of the politics behind that, because we saw them and they were kind of most naturally just the bad side. The Burg was the better of the two, but there was really no depth to that. I would like to see if that's going to just be something in the history, or if that's going to be something that people still have today.
So I just wanted, since you had mentioned, we talked about Tourmaline, Margaret just added this here about Tourmaline being, quite the icon before. So there's a lot there. So. But anyone else?
I definitely want to see, Sophie and Jonah's relationship and characters evolve. I thought Sophie it was very much a small taste character. We got little glimpses of what was driving her and why she was doing what she does, but where her loyalties are and what actually motivates her is a big mystery. And I think the actress pulled it off really, really well. She's very mysterious and very good at playing multiple sides of issues, and just to see how her and Jonah evolve both separately and, Game of Thrones-ish together or not, like depending on whether they're together or what have you. I'm curious to see where they're going to go to. So, but I definitely want to see where is it. I think I'm remembering this correctly, that the reason that this world ended up with having these creatures is because there was almost they're not native to this, or is it the other way around? Like there's somewhere where like the worlds were melding or something like that, and that's how
I
they
think Tirnanok, they were native to Tirnanok.
Yes,
Is the impression
the
I got.
fairies are native to Tirnanok, but the Critch, the pucks are someplace else.
Yeah.
And Agreus mentions where they're from, but the Tirnanok, and Tirnanok is the name of like in Irish mythology, like the Druids, like that's a place in.
Yeah, it's the fairyland. Yeah,
that's definitely the Fae.
They were just discovered, sometime in the recent history, meaning the last 10, 50, 100 years.
I think Andy's right though. Didn't they somehow end up in that other world not of their own volition?
Some of them, but I don't think all of them.
Okay. Because I know that they did those little vignettes in the beginning of each episode where they would explain a little bit about the history. And so, but I agree with Corinne. I like finding out more of the backstory, but I'm also curious, of course, what happens, something that John Paul brought up was, are we going to pick up, 5 minutes later or 5 months later? And, it'll be difficult to satisfy everyone if it's one or the other, because, you do want to see maybe there's a little bit of time difference between where things ended and where did they pick up. But if you do too much, then they have to do too much explaining. And, rather than they have to do too much telling rather than showing. So it could be that it would make more sense for it to be just a short period of time. I want to know what happens. What's that?
I don't know if because they've already, like the way that they layered in like history in the current season, like they mention things in passing and there's enough context to understand what they're talking about without having to go into the backstory. Like we learn about this elixir and this infestation of this drug in the culture, and how and the reason why all these people are here, the refugees, like they didn't really have to go into all of it. They just mentioned it enough. So they might be able to do it, like even if it was like a year into the future, because like I'm trying to think of like under what circumstances would Imogen and Mr. Agreus come back and have it meaningful, and it's going to have to be like a big span of time for them. Like so maybe they come back at the end of season 2. But even if it started off with them coming back onto the shore and everyone's still scandalized, if a year had gone by, I trust that the writers could continue to be artful in the way that they share.
Well, that could be. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I agree to a certain extent. But I think that once you become invested in characters and in their, you're whatever their motivations happen to be, and you're interested in their stories, you don't necessarily want there to be a big gap in time either in order to find out what happens next. So but I guess, it's not as though any of us have anything to say about it, but we'll be curious how they actually pulled off, right?
Well, they haven't started filming it, so maybe they can just crib some of our ideas. I'm just saying.
I'm sure they'll be watching.
And to Corinne's point, if the story is done right, I mean, let's go back to, I feel old saying this, an old classic. When you go from Star Wars: A New Hope to Empire Strikes Back, there's quite a bit of time between the destruction of the Death Star and then being on Hoth. I mean, quite a bit of time. But you don't have to be told everything that happened in between. You just pick right up because you know the characters and you just dive right into the new situation. If they can construct the story well enough and dive right into it, I would rather there be some time. That way you're not having to watch the seconds tick by. Instead, you get to
watching your watch. Huh?
Yeah.
Well, and everybody's aging while COVID is holding us back. So it might be like years before they can do this. So we have to have it be realistic because they're all elderly and gray, you know?
It's a really great cast. The cast of the show is like John Paul was pointing out, where Orlando Bloom would react to little comments, and just they're all like that. They're all, the entire cast, even Flurry and like some of the little, the smaller roles. They're all just a really strong cast, and I trust that between them and the writing, that wherever they pick up, that we're going to catch on, and hopefully the great pacing and the great juggling of all the different storylines continues in the second season.
Yeah, I think they've left a lot of little loops, and I could see them, like you said, waiting a couple months, because I wanted to mention this. I put a little notice out, and I showed it to some of my panelists here. Kind of stealthily, they actually put out a whole tabletop role-playing game, which has a lot more of the world developed in. There are a ton of countries, all this kind of stuff. They clearly have got a big Bible to think of. Wherever Imogene and Grace are going, maybe they'll be coming back with a whole flow of people, being like,
well, that's true, yeah.
So, and we don't know much about the pact. That all we know is they have uniforms and they chase after people, and they're just as horrifying in some ways as, the soldiers of the Berg too. So there's a lot of loose ends.
And I'm sure Amazon would love to do like The Witcher is doing, that has the spinoff that's telling the history of the first Witcher. I'm sure they would love to use all that, fleshed out world from the role-playing game and tell more about the original war from different characters' points of view. Go to Freehold and tell a story in Freehold. Maybe you tell Mr. Agrias' story of when he was basically a bounty hunter. You could do so many different stories all happening at the same time. I mean, more like Star Trek, do one, wait a couple weeks, start the next one, and you could have, around the calendar, one after another.
That's
so
awesome.
I did just want to share out the link, but we're getting towards the end. So any kind of last thoughts that people have on this, or anything that we wanted to kind of bring up or share?
This show for me was just such a tip of the iceberg for this enormous, it was so ambitious. And I think ultimately for me, it was successful. I think what they had all this just tremendously ambitious, goals for creating this huge world that, like, as you said, there's all these countries in the tabletop and all this. Clearly they have so much more to explore. I hope it gets a few more seasons. I hope we get to do some more deep dives in the different corners of their society, because, it's different than anything that's on TV right now. It's not just because of the fairies that look great, but it is really different than anything that's on TV right now. And it deserves to go on for a few more seasons.
Yeah,
I agree. I think they did it so well. They fed us just the tip, and we know that there's more, and it's, I don't know, really so well done.
I'll say, if you want a great experience, if you have not watched it at all, for anybody who's watching this because they were just curious, if you've not watched it at all, or maybe if you watched it and want to try it again, when I watched this, it came out about the same time as the Dark Crystal series over on Netflix. Both fantasy, very, very different tone, and we alternated. I don't usually like to sit and just binge watch something. So every couple of days, we would alternate. One episode of Carnival Row, wait 2 days. One episode of Dark Crystal, wait 2 days, back and forth. And
wait that long.
such a contrast in styles and everything else, but both being so fantasy, such a rich, deep fantasy world that is fleshed out. It's an incredible experience to watch those two shows interchange like that. So just something to think about.
And actually, it brings up that was our plan to do too. Because of course they literally came out the same day, and
which was the first day of time.
We found ourselves then slowly creeping up, and we did Carnival Row much faster than Dark Crystal. I don't know why. The pacing of the Dark Crystal was slower. We were talking about the pacing earlier, so I know we just ended up inhaling Carnival Row. So
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I hope there's a lot of cosplayers next year. So.
Oh, I would love to see that.
Yes. Costumes.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
All right. Any other last minute things anybody wants to share about themselves, any kind of other things. We're getting ready for actually, Margaret brought up a good point here in chat. For those of you who don't know, they did do a prequel from
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It is only available though on Audible. So definitely kind of check that out if you haven't. I know I've been wanting to hear the book myself. I wish they put it out some other places, but Audible's doing that a lot lately. But so that's another place you can get a little bit of a fix of your Carnival row for in the meantime while we're dealing with COVID. A great chance to do that. And I just want to bring up next week we are going to be doing another live panel. That next week we're going to be doing Doom Patrol. So another quirky, odd, a little out of the box series. So
No.
because of course there's not enough time in Dragon Con weekend to kind of cover all of this kind of thing. But we are going to be doing some live panels building up to Dragon Con itself, and then of course Dragon Con weekend. They are going to be running a lot of channels 24/7 during the weekend. And I know that both my track and Carol's track on Urban Fantasy is going to be doing some live panels as well that weekend because there's just too much to cover. We have such a wealth now to watch and enjoy that it's like the days of 5 shows total are long gone.
Oh yeah.
Right.
You can't watch everything. You can't watch everything. That's my mantra. You can't watch everything.
Nope.
That's true.
We're trying.
Enough time, I can watch it.
Try.
Yeah.
COVID has been very good for that.
Yes.
I'm caught up on a lot of things.
I know. It's like, hey, I'm done with the internet. Is there another streaming channel? I don't know. I have nothing else to watch.
I'm sure we can find you some more. So, all right, everybody. For our viewers, thank you very much. For my panelists, if you guys can hang on for a minute, and thanks everybody. Otherwise,
Thank you.
Bye.